The sun rose slow over Denton Hollow that morning, the way it always did when the wind had been kind the night before. It was October 4th, 1859, and there were still apples on the branch and children on porches. Nothing in the fields gave reason for concern. Nothing in the air carried warning. But the Halstead place was quiet. Too quiet. A neighbor boy, sent with a wrapped pie for Margaret's birthday, stood at the fence for a long time before approaching the door. The pie stayed warm in his hands. The dog didn't bark. He called out once, then twice. Still no one came. The boy would later say the silence inside the house felt like something listening, like something waiting for the last footstep to settle. When the sheriff arrived, the front door was latched but not locked. There was no sign of a break-in, no overturned chairs, no open drawers, no blood, no mess of any kind. The table was set for 4. There was steam still rising from the eggs, plates full, biscuits buttered, bacon not yet cold, a pitcher of milk with beads of sweat. Someone had poured coffee, then walked away before sipping it. The fire in the hearth gave a tired breath when the front door opened. The chairs were warm. The Halsteads had been seen the night before. Ezra had carried a basket of squash to the roadside table. Margaret had spoken to the pastor's wife about Sunday hymns. The girls had picked pears, laughing in the dirt. No one in Denton Hollow could understand it. No tracks led from the house. No wagon was taken. All their shoes were still lined up neatly by the door. Their coats hung where they always did, beneath the window where Margaret stitched by hand. Her needle and thread lay beside a half-finished blue apron, threaded but not knotted. A single stool was tipped near the stove, like someone had risen too fast. The calendar still read Monday. The milk hadn't spoiled, and not a soul in that town would dare touch a thing. The sheriff, a quiet man named Lowell, had known Ezra Halstead for 20 years. They had built the town's first corral together. Margaret had nursed Lowell's wife during a winter illness that nearly took her life. The Halsteads were not wealthy, not devout, but they were stable, practical. The girls, Ruth, age 10, and Sarah, 7, had perfect attendance at school. Sarah had once won a ribbon for memorizing every county seat in Missouri. Ruth was often seen with her hand on her sister's back when they walked, guiding her like a shadow, trying to stay close. There had been no complaints, no sickness, no debts. Only one strange thing was ever mentioned in their file, and even that was buried deep. A single report from 3 years prior where Margaret had written to a cousin in St. Louis that she worried her youngest had been waking up with words not hers. But that letter had never been mailed. It was found in the ashes of their hearth years later, half singed and folded inside a dried bouquet. What unsettled the townsfolk most was not the absence of the family, though that would weigh heavy in time, but the sense that something had been paused, as if the house had inhaled and never let the breath out. The door to the master bedroom was shut, not locked. The bed was made. The pillows bore the impression of recent weight. Margaret's hairbrush still held a strand of red. The daughter's room was untouched, dolls lined perfectly on the windowsill, nightgowns folded over the bed's edge, a row of pebbles placed deliberately in a crescent shape across the floor. No one knew why, and perhaps no one wanted to. The sheriff walked the perimeter twice, listening. He crouched beside the barn, ran his hand over the wood grain, checked the feed. The animals had not been fed that morning, but none had starved. He opened the trapdoor to the root cellar and saw nothing out of place. Pickled beans, smoked fish, red jars labeled in Margaret's even handwriting. He shut it softly as if not to wake something. By dusk, the sheriff placed a single rope across the front porch. Not a barricade, more a marker, a signal. Townsfolk didn't question it. They just crossed themselves and turned away. For weeks, no one went back. Leaves collected at the door. Snow dusted the sill. And yet every person who passed by claimed they smelled coffee, claimed the chimney sometimes whispered, that the rocking chair on the porch moved when there was no wind, and that no matter how cold the nights grew, there was always heat behind the windows. Just enough to cast shadows inside, but no one to make them. The town would try to explain it away. A family crisis, a runaway, maybe even a quiet pact between four souls tired of something too heavy to speak. But no note was left. No word sent, no footprints found. They simply stopped being. And something in that house, in that warmth, remained, as if whatever had taken them needed the world to believe they'd never truly gone, as if the house itself had learned how to perform their absence, and was still rehearsing it. It was the widow Melora Thatch who first noticed something wrong with the number of doors. She lived just across the field in the lean house with no paint and too many wind chimes. She'd been watching the Halsteads long before they vanished, not out of suspicion but out of a loneliness that made her memorize the way families moved. She said she used to count their doors every spring just to keep herself sharp. 5. Always 5. One front, one back, 2 bedrooms, and a pantry. But then one morning, not long before they disappeared, she counted 6. She swore on her husband's grave she hadn't miscounted. She had stood in her kitchen wiping the same window pane again and again with her apron, staring hard at the side of the Halstead house where something new had grown. A door that didn't match the others. Set too low, painted over too quickly. A door that didn't belong. At first she told no one, but as the days passed, she began to recall other things. Things that hadn't felt strange at the time but curled back up in memory with sharpened teeth. She remembered Margaret dragging something across the yard one cloudy afternoon. A bundle wrapped tight in oilskin heavy enough to make her limp. She had looked over her shoulder twice. She hadn't waved. Melora assumed it was venison or firewood wrapped to stay dry. But now, she said, the shape had been too clean, too human, and it wasn't the dragging that frightened her in hindsight. It was where Margaret had taken it, not to the cellar or the barn, but toward the new door, the 6th door, the one that was gone by the time the sheriff arrived. The more Melora spoke, the more the town listened. She said Ruth, the older girl, had taken to wearing gloves that summer, even on the hottest days, even when no one else would step into the sun. She wore them in church, white and too big, the kind used for cleaning silver. She never took them off, not even to eat. Margaret said it was for a rash. But Melora swore she saw black lines drawn on the girl's palms, lines that looked burned in, not drawn, and followed no path she recognized. As for Sarah, the younger child, she had stopped answering to her name altogether. Instead, she would sing, not songs from town or church, but low, strange chants that carried into Melora's yard even when the windows were closed. Words that didn't belong to children. Melora didn't understand them, but she remembered how they made her feel, like being looked at from underneath. Others began to whisper. The pastor's wife admitted she'd seen Ezra pacing behind the schoolhouse late one evening, whispering into the dirt. The blacksmith claimed he once sold Ezra a dozen hand-forged bolts and a set of narrow hinges, though no one could find where they had been used. Even the teacher remembered that when Ruth was asked to draw her home, she had drawn the same house 6 times in a row, each one more slanted, the walls twisting, windows smaller, until the final one had no windows at all and a roof that dipped inward like a mouth. She had folded the last one into her pocket before anyone could ask why. Melora said the air around that side of the house had changed. It was colder, and birds stopped landing on the sill. Once, when walking past to gather herbs, she thought she heard breathing. Not loud, not sharp, just steady, like someone too patient to blink. She wrote the sheriff a letter, unsigned, and left it under his door. She told him about the gloves, about the door, about the bundle. She begged him not to go alone, but by then it was too late. The Halsteads were already gone. Some thought Melora had lost her mind. Her grief curdled after too many winters without a voice beside her. But those who visited her claimed she had one room in her house with a nailed board across it. When asked, she said she couldn't remember why it was sealed, just that it felt wrong to open it, and some believed her, because they too had started noticing things they couldn't explain. The Halstead's front door sometimes opened a crack at night, then shut again. The same hymn kept playing in their heads, the one Sarah used to hum, though no one remembered when they last heard it played. And some said they now counted the doors of their own homes before going to sleep, just to be sure, because no one could remember the Halsteads building an extra room, and no one had seen it torn down. But Melora had counted, once 5, then 6, then gone. Dr. Albrecht Maurer arrived in Denton Hollow under gray skies and with clean boots, his coat too fine for the mud and his words chosen too carefully for the people. He said he had come from New Orleans by way of Paris, though no one could place his accent. He was soft-spoken, almost kind, with a way of tilting his head while you talked, like he was listening not to your words, but to your blood. He brought with him a single trunk, iron-bound, heavy enough to require 2 men to lift, though he wouldn't allow them. He rolled it himself through the Halstead's front gate and into the guest room that no one but Margaret ever entered. He claimed to be a surgeon. French-trained, he said, though he pronounced it as if it were a different kind of training altogether. He used words like hematic inheritance and spinal acquiescence, and asked Ezra if he'd ever measured his daughter's bones for spiritual consistency. Ezra had laughed, Margaret had not. Maurer spoke often of progress. He believed death was unnecessary for understanding the soul. He said autopsies were barbaric, but only because they were late. He claimed that the right observation, at the right hour of the right kind of child, could yield the same truths as a corpse without ever causing death. He said blood remembered more than the body did, that a family's pain could be read through the skin, if the light was right. He asked strange questions at supper, whether the children slept facing east, whether Margaret had ever miscarried, whether Ruth had been born during a thunderstorm. He was particularly interested in Sarah. He said her voice carried what he called echo resonance, a vibratory pattern found in twins even when no twin had survived. Margaret had started limiting his time with them, but not before he had touched the back of Sarah's neck and called it holy. The day before he left, he asked for a map of the town, but not the streets. He wanted soil composition, wind tunnels, and school attendance logs from the past decade. He said families that disappeared often left a sound behind. That towns like Denton Hollow heard it but didn't know how to listen. When he packed, the trunk seemed lighter. Ezra asked if he would be returning. Mauer had smiled and said only if the daughters proved inconsistent. Then he walked out before dawn and was never seen again. 2 days later, the Halsteads vanished. What wasn't known at the time, what wouldn't be uncovered until decades later, was Mauer's name etched into records in France. A sealed court inquiry in Strasbourg in 1839 described a man of matching description who had been accused of submitting false medical trials involving school children. No formal charges were brought. The records were sealed after 3 judges resigned without comment. In Lyon, 2 orphanages closed the same year following a quiet investigation into sleep deprivation experiments disguised as night terrors. One girl from that inquiry, found catatonic in a laundry closet, had scratched the phrase "blood remembers" into her leg with a bone shard. The trunk, which was later seized from a rail depot in Alabama, contained papers soaked in a dark resin, bones from at least 4 species labeled only with numbers, and a leather folio marked "reversals." Inside were diagrams of children drawn as organs, one with no mouth but 3 tongues, another labeled "vocal mimicry achieved" beneath a picture of 2 identical hearts. There were journal entries dated back 15 years. They described experiments in neurologic planting, a method Mauer claimed allowed children to inherit memories not from their parents but from their environment. Memories of trauma, obedience, or music rewritten onto the body without teaching. His theory was that silence could be taught not through punishment but through blood patterns triggered in the spinal cord before age 10. In one note he wrote, "A silent child is not broken. She is prepared." No one knew why he chose the Halsteads. Some believed Margaret had sent a letter requesting his help with Sarah's sleepwalking. Others claimed Ezra owed a debt from the war and agreed to host Mauer as a favor to an old surgeon. But no proof of either was found. The only hard evidence of his time there was a hair ribbon that did not belong to either girl, later found under a floorboard with the letter M burned into the wood beside it. Margaret had no siblings, neither did Ezra. The behavioral harvesting Mauer practiced was never officially acknowledged. It was too strange, too unfixed in method. But its traces remain in small-town schoolhouses where children were once punished for speaking before sunrise, in asylums where patients were listed by family relation but kept from one another at all times, in field hospitals where anesthesia was withheld until the patient's body mimicked prayer. His legacy was not medicine. It was silence, and some believed he taught people how to make it last forever. What Denton Hollow didn't understand was that Mauer hadn't left, not completely, because he never needed to. He had already begun. And when silence settles that quickly in a house, when warmth fades but doesn't leave, it isn't because something ended. It's because something was passed down. The chimney hadn't drawn smoke in years. The house had been quiet for decades, sealed and then left to rot. until a storm in the summer of 1901 split one of the roof beams clean in half. Rain soaked through the parlor floor, and beneath the wet plaster, behind a brick that crumbled too easily, someone found them. Pages folded and tucked into a soot-stained cloth, stitched tight with hair. The writing inside was Margaret Halstead's. Her hand was small and sharp, pressed deep into the paper like she was trying to make the ink hurt. She never addressed anyone. The entries had no dates, only numbers crossed out and rewritten, as if time had stopped keeping count. The first pages were mundane, mentions of headaches, fatigue, dreams of drowning, the sound of Sarah humming in her sleep. Then, without warning, the words shifted. Margaret began referring to herself not as mother or wife, but as the host. She described something she called heat fasting, a treatment Dr. Maurer had recommended to strengthen her womb. She had been instructed to lie beside the fire for hours, fully clothed, without water, until she stopped shivering. She was told to repeat certain phrases during the process, lines that resembled prayers but weren't. Phrases that had no meaning, yet somehow made her throat swell when spoken. He said they would purge her softness. That softness bred confusion. That confusion let the womb wander. And a wandering womb, he said, was the root of all disobedience. Later entries spoke of injections. Thin needles filled with a red fluid that Maurer wouldn't name. He said it came from remembered pain. The fluid left her weak for hours but gave her visions, not of her own life but of women in stone basins, children asleep with open eyes, and fields where no sound echoed. She wrote that after each injection she could no longer tell where her daughters ended and she began. Ruth started copying her movements exactly. Sarah began whispering the names of herbs Margaret hadn't spoken aloud since her own mother died. Maurer said this was progress, that the girls were aligning. She wrote of her body refusing food, of her tongue splitting at the edges. Maurer said the mouth was the last place softness hid. He applied heated pins to her tongue and told her to hum through the pain. When Ezra protested, Maurer spoke quietly to him in the barn. After that, Ezra stopped questioning. Margaret wrote that he would walk into the fields before dawn and not return until after dark. Once she found him kneeling in the dirt, weeping, whispering the word undo. She asked what needed undoing. He didn't answer. But later that night, he stood over Sarah's bed for nearly an hour, never moving, never touching her, just watching her breathe. The entries grew more frantic. Margaret began to repeat herself. She wrote the phrase, "We're too late," over 20 times in a single margin. She claimed the house had grown another room, one she hadn't built, and that Ruth had started locking herself inside it at night. She begged Maurer to stop the treatments. He replied, she wrote, by offering her something stronger. He called it the final clearing. She refused. The next day, Sarah's eyes changed color. Not fully, just a ring around the iris that turned pale. Ezra asked if she remembered falling. She didn't. Margaret said her daughter had begun to speak with a voice that sounded borrowed, a voice that knew things she hadn't been taught. One of the last entries was barely legible. Margaret wrote of standing outside the hidden room holding a mirror to the door's crack, too afraid to open it. What she saw inside made her drop the mirror. She never described it, only that it wasn't her daughter anymore. It was something dressed in Ruth's outline. She wrote that Mauer had shown her what it meant to plant memory like seed, and that in trying to remove softness from herself, she had softened the space between her children's thoughts and someone else's. She had become the bridge. The final page was blank except for a single line. He never touched them. He only rewrote what they'd already forgotten. The diary ended there. But whoever read it first, the sheriff perhaps or someone from the state, didn't speak of it publicly. The pages were locked away, and the chimney was sealed again, not out of shame, but because some truths do not rot. They wait, and if opened too soon, they remember. The house had been abandoned for over 30 years when the state finally sent someone to walk its bones. The floors sagged, the windows wept rot, and the yard had swallowed the fence whole. But in 1892, after a string of reports from nearby settlers, stories of sounds at night, of children waking without memories, of animals refusing to cross the Halstead property line, the county sheriff ordered the home surveyed. Not for ghosts, he said, for architecture. Because something was wrong with how the place stood. It didn't lean, it didn't creak, it didn't breathe. It just waited. The men who came with their tools and notes found the house almost too symmetrical. The 4 main walls aligned as expected. The measurements matched every plan registered in county records. But then came the 5th room. There was no blueprint for it, no paper, no permit, no ledger entry in Ezra Halstead's own handwriting. And yet there it stood, a windowless room sealed from the inside, its doorway framed in different wood. Lighter, less worn. At first they thought it might have been added later. But the surveyor crouched near the floor and noticed something deeper. The grain in the floorboards didn't match. The nails were newer. The boards above didn't line up with the beams below. He tapped the planks. One rang hollow. They dug beneath the house slowly. The crawl space should have been shallow, just enough to run a line or stack firewood. Instead, they uncovered a hidden foundation segment unlike any other. 4 beams, raw and misaligned, jammed into the earth at odd angles, forming a square just wide enough to hold a child's bed. But there was no bed. Only the frame. It was built from rough pine, too small for an adult, and nailed into the floor to keep it from shifting. Rope loops were still tied to the frame's posts. The floor beneath was packed dirt, and in its center, a single iron ring embedded in stone. Around it, 10 nails. Each one driven point up into the earth, arranged in a spiral. Not wide enough for someone to stand in. Only crouch. Only curl. No furniture was found. No lamp, no chest, no toys. But in the wall they found something stranger. A hole no wider than a coin, drilled from the inside out. On the outer wall, the hole was filled with wax. The wood around it had been blackened, like heat had been pushed through it again and again until the board had started to blister. No one knew what it meant at the time, but someone later wrote in a report that it looked like the kind of hole used in puppet theaters. A place for sound to travel but not light. A hole for listening. A hole for learning. The ropes on the bed frame were stained dark. One of them had hair caught in the knot, pale and fine. The sheriff said nothing when he saw it. He only asked if the surveyor had children of his own. The man said yes. A girl, 8. And for a moment the sheriff looked like he might weep, not out of sorrow but out of something worse. Recognition. It was Melora Thatch, The widow who'd once counted doors, who came forward after the findings were made public. She said she remembered hearing crying from the house in the months before the Halsteads vanished. Not loud, but strange, like someone trying to sound like a child but forgetting how. The cries had rhythm, she said, too perfect. They rose and fell like recitation. She had told herself it was a fox or the wind catching a shutter. But the moment she heard about the nails, she knew. She had heard something practicing. Later, a local historian tried to argue the room was a storm shelter built without record because of pride or shame. But no storm shelter needs a ring in the floor. No shelter needs ropes, and none is built to face inward, with walls padded not with straw or stone, but thick cloth soaked in animal fat. That was what they found stitched into the corners. Cloth made to hold scent, to confuse sound. One investigator called it an acoustic blindfold. Another said nothing at all and quit the job the next day. The report filed in 1892 used the phrase experimental confinement. The sheriff refused to sign it. He wrote a single line instead. This room was not built for shelter. It was built to train something in the dark. And after that, no one went back under the house. Because once you start asking which voice is real and which one was taught to cry, it doesn't take long for silence to start sounding like imitation. And imitation always comes from somewhere. It began the following spring, just as the fields thawed and the new settlers moved in. Their boots still too clean and their barns not yet built. The Halstead house remained boarded, leaning into itself like it knew it was no longer a home. But the sound came anyway. Not from the house exactly, but from the air around it. A soft, circular tune, always the same, humming just before dawn. No words, no instruments, just a melody simple enough to be remembered, slow enough to sink. At first, people assumed it was wind or animal. A trick of the valley's echo, but it came every morning. Same rhythm, same notes, and those who lived closest began waking to it, not from sleep, but from dreams they didn't remember falling into. The hymn, as it came to be known, did not feel evil. That was the trouble. It felt warm, familiar, something half-known. The kind of sound you don't realize you've heard before until it's inside you. Children began humming it while they played, unaware. Mothers reported it at night, leaking through the windows. One man said he found his son sitting in the hallway, humming with his eyes closed, smiling faintly. Another said his youngest began writing the same sequence of marks into the dirt every time the melody played, a circle, a cross, then a mark like a key without teeth. The pastor at Denton Hollow's chapel was the first to connect it. During a sermon on the dangers of superstition, he froze mid-sentence. The tune had floated through the rafters. And he remembered it, not from hymns, not from scripture, but from a story Margaret Halstead had once told. She had sung it as a lullaby long ago during a church picnic when Sarah had fallen asleep in her lap. She had said her own mother taught it to her. Not from the Bible, she'd joked, but from before that. The tune, she'd said, was meant to keep children quiet, meant to still the mind. She never said what happened if you stopped singing it too early. Once the tune was recognized, the town turned. Whispers became warnings. Parents began keeping children indoors during the mornings. A family moved 2 towns away after their boy claimed he saw Ruth Halstead standing in the well behind the school, though it had been dry for years. But the hymn didn't stop. If anything, it grew more precise, stronger. It echoed sharper. It lingered longer. And then a child vanished. Her name was Lydia Wren, 6 years old, lived on the edge of the valley with her mother, Annalise. She had been seen playing with corn husks the night before just outside the house. By morning she was gone. No tracks, no signs of struggle. Her shoes still by the bed, her nightdress hanging on the porch rail. When asked what she remembered, Annalise said only one thing. Her daughter had stood in the middle of the room just before dawn and whispered, "I saw Mama Halstead in the wall." Then she laid down. And when Annalise woke again, she was alone. Search parties found nothing. But that night, the hymn returned. This time it came from 2 places. Not just the wind, but from inside Annalise's chimney. She swore it echoed up through the ash, that it sounded like her daughter humming into stone. The sheriff visited the house and claimed he heard nothing. But his deputy, younger and not yet trained to lie, said he felt something cold pass through his sleeve, as if a child had reached for him. The hymn was banned. The pastor issued a decree, unofficial but understood. No singing in the mornings, no whistling near the Halstead house, no repeating the tune, not even in jest. He said melodies were doors, that some opened from both sides, and that the Halsteads, wherever they were, might have left something behind. Not a ghost, not a curse, just a rhythm that remembered. Years later, that same hymn would be found notated in a book of frontier lullabies collected by a music historian from St. Louis. He claimed it was one of the oldest surviving oral melodies in Missouri. Said it likely came from an unnamed settler sect in the 1700s who believed children could carry unfinished prayers in their breath. The hymn, he noted, had no author. It appeared in fragments across generations, always the same notes, always without words. He titled it, "The Silence Between Daughters." The archivist who typed the entry added a note in the margin. She said the melody had stuck with her, said she couldn't stop humming it, and after that she stopped returning to work. No one could say why, only that she was last seen outside the archive building, staring up at the bricks as if trying to see someone on the other side. The judge's land had always been considered unlucky. It sat north of Denton Hollow, just beyond the old river bend where the fields turned brittle, and the crows circled longer than they should. It was good land in theory, fertile, flat. But no crop held more than a season, and the air never quite cleared. In 1873, the boundary between that land and a neighboring homestead came into question after a stone fence collapsed during a storm. The 2 families filed claims. A court-appointed surveyor was sent to resolve the matter. And that's when the limestone cap was found. A flat, circular slab tucked beneath the brush, half buried in the dirt, untouched by time. There were no carvings, no markings, but it had weight, too much for one man to lift without tools. The surveyor noted it as possible well cover and flagged it for removal. He was wrong. The slab took 3 men and 2 hours to raise. Beneath it they found no water, just cold, dry stone and a pit barely 4 feet deep. And inside the pit they found 6 small skeletons curled inward, stacked without care, each one no longer than a child of 8 or 9. But their skulls told another story. The eye sockets were wide, the jawbones pronounced, and the teeth, especially the incisors, were shaped in ways no child's should be. A forensic specialist summoned from Boston months later would confirm what locals had only whispered. The teeth had been filed, not sharpened, not broken. Filed to mimic the arc and spacing of an adult's grin. The kind of grin worn too long. The kind of grin that hides something. The bones were brittle but intact. No burial cloth, no coffins. Each child had their arms folded unnaturally tight, as if molded before the bones had fully set. A few of the rib cages bore signs of unnatural compression, like weight had been applied in cycles. Not enough to kill, just enough to reshape. One skull bore holes near the temples, shallow even, as if something had once been fixed to the sides. The official record marked it as unexplained cranial wear, but others called it what it was, harness marks. Among the bones, partially wedged beneath one pelvis, was a copper disc no wider than a button. Its surface was scorched, but the engraving had survived. 2 letters etched with a steady hand, E.H. The initials matched Ezra Halstead, but the copper was newly minted, the kind used not in clothing but in identification tags for livestock and property. What it meant was never confirmed. Some believed Ezra had marked it himself, a claim of ownership. Others believed the opposite, that someone had made it to look like him to lead investigators back to the wrong door. That the copper tag was a lure, and whoever placed it knew what it would do. The property was sealed, quietly. The judge who owned the land was compensated by the state and moved east. The 2 families arguing over the fence withdrew their claims. No one ever built there again. It became wild ground. The kind children were warned to stay away from, not because of danger, but because of forgetting. Those who stepped too close claimed they lost track of time. One boy said he stood near the well and forgot his own name for an hour. His mother never let him out of the house again. Years later in Boston, the forensic specialist who had studied the remains gave a private lecture to a group of medical students. He spoke not of the Halstead case directly, but of unnatural growth theories, fringe beliefs held by certain 19th century surgeons. The idea that with the right pressure, right posture, and right environment, a child's body could be forced to mature in specific areas even if the rest of them stayed small. He called it ritual ossification. He said it was never accepted by science, but it was practiced, quietly, especially in places where obedience was more important than survival. One of the students asked why anyone would file a child's teeth to mimic a smile. The specialist gave no answer, but a transcript of the lecture showed a single line added later in the margin. Some smiles are not meant to express joy. They are meant to confuse predators or attract them. No one ever claimed the bodies. No missing persons report from that decade matched the number. The town listed the site as a historical oddity and moved on. But some say if you kneel by the old stone ring on a cold night and wait in silence, you can hear something breathing beneath the dirt. Not weeping, not crying, just breathing. Slow and steady, like someone waiting to be asked a question they've already rehearsed the answer to. And when you leave, the tune that follows you home isn't one you know, but it knows you, and it wants to be remembered. In 1881, after years of political delay and internal collapse, the Missouri Medical Board was forced to open its long-sealed archive to public review. The reason was simple. A legal challenge over medical rights in rural communities had unearthed documents thought to have been destroyed decades earlier. Hidden in a locked drawer marked "Inquiries Unapproved," a thin leather-bound folder was found. No label, no signature on the front, just a single brass clasp holding it shut. Inside were 14 reports submitted by a man named Albrecht Mauer, the same Mauer whose name had vanished from every official register since 1860. The reports were not medical in the usual sense. There were no prescriptions, no treatments, only trials. 14 of them spread across 5 years, submitted quietly, stamped reviewed, and filed away without any response. Not accepted, not denied, just filed, like someone had decided the less said the better. The title on the first page read, "Voluntary Trials in Cognitive Erasure." It was dated June 1856 and listed a location in an unincorporated settlement in the western frontier. The subject, age 9, was referred to only as S. Mauer detailed a method called sensory rebalancing, which involved periods of forced silence lasting 6 days, followed by 8 hours of whisper instruction in a language the subject did not speak. Food was denied for the duration except for a broth he described as scentless and mineral-thickened. He claimed the subject stopped using pronouns after day 4 and refused to recognize her own reflection after day 6. On the 7th day, she reportedly began responding to questions before they were asked. Mauer's conclusion read, "Predictive mimicry successful. Subject awaits reapplication." The next 13 reports grew more violent in theory, though never in language. Mauer described heat dilution, a method by which subjects were exposed to carefully controlled body temperature changes to dull emotional patterning. He wrote that a child whose body was taught not to shiver would also stop fearing punishment. He outlined ritual ingestion, a process of replacing meals with repeated taste exposure to dirt, chalk, and ash, materials he believed would strip the tongue of familial nostalgia. He referred to the mothers of subjects not as parents but as origin carriers. He referred to the children themselves as stage-ready vessels. One document claimed that a Bolaba child could be conditioned to obey any order if trained to associate stillness with reward and movement with absence. He called it obedience without condition. He insisted that full silence before the age of 10 could allow for what he described as pre-reflective alignment, a state of mind where the child would no longer think before acting, only wait for direction no matter who gave it. Each report bore a signature of receipt. 14 names, all members of the state's Rural Medical Review panel at the time. And every single man who signed went missing, fell ill, or died within 5 years of that review period. One walked into the river. Another was found locked in his own cellar, having scribbled the words, "They already know," across every wall in soot. One man left town in the middle of the night, abandoning his wife and daughters. He was later found in Wyoming under a different name. When questioned, he refused to speak and never wrote again. The final reviewer, a physician from Boone County, was found seated at his kitchen table with his own medical file clutched in both hands. He had removed his tongue with a kitchen blade and died from the bleeding. No suicide note was found. But his wife told the sheriff he'd said 2 days prior, "It's not that I'm sorry, it's that I remember." After these incidents, the folder was quietly moved. It never went to Washington. It never entered federal record. It was buried beneath layers of unrelated filings and sealed in the basement archive of the State University under a false classification. Contested trials, botany. It was found only by accident. The clerk who opened it resigned that week. He left no formal complaint, but he mailed an unsigned letter to the local paper, which was printed without explanation. It read, "Some tests were never meant to be passed, only repeated." The medical community refused to acknowledge the reports publicly. They claimed the methods were theoretical, the subjects unnamed, and the results unverifiable. But others knew. A few local doctors began checking older children for signs. Inconsistent sleep patterns, mirrored speech, refusal to blink during conversation. One child in a nearby school was removed from class after reciting numbers in a pattern too precise to be learned by accident. When asked where he heard them, he said, "My bones remember." None of the subjects named in the trials were ever identified. The initials changed each time. The locations were vague. But a pattern emerged, each one tied to a settlement that later suffered unexplained disappearances, institutional closures, or sudden mass relocations. Denton Hollow appeared in 3 of the reports, though never by name, only as settlement within alignment zone. What Maurer believed is now clearer than ever. He did not seek to kill. He did not seek to cure. He sought to erase the boundary between choice and response. He believed silence was not the absence of sound, but the absence of self. And he found families willing, or desperate and proud enough to let him try. The folder was returned to storage. The brass clasp was replaced with a lock. But the melody that tied the names together, the rhythm behind the silence, had already spread. Some truths don't survive in writing. They survive in the things we no longer question, the way a child waits too long before answering, the way a lullaby feels colder the second time, the way silence once taught becomes harder to unteach. The Halstead house stood for 45 years after its family disappeared. Weather worn it. Ivy split the roof beams, but it remained whole in the ways that mattered. The frame unbroken, the windows never fully shattered, the chimney never cold long enough to forget what passed through it. In the fall of 1903, a man named Daniel Grice bought the house for less than its timber was worth. He moved in with his wife Miriam and their 6 children. The town said nothing. People had stopped warning outsiders. Let them learn for themselves, they thought. Let them see if memory still clings to wood. The Grices arrived in October. By February, the house had begun speaking again. It started with the youngest boy, Caleb. He was 5, quiet by nature. But after 2 weeks in the house, he stopped speaking altogether. Not out of fear, out of habit. His mother said he watched the fireplace for hours without blinking. When asked why, he tapped the stone. He seemed to be listening. 2 weeks later, his older sister began whispering words their parents had never taught her. Alignment, pre-reflection, obedience zones. She spoke them at night in her sleep, always facing the far wall. When woken, she wept but didn't know why. Another child began to mimic voices, one not his family's but others. A woman's tone too old for his throat. A man's flat rhythm that made no sense. The Grices wrote it off as nerves or growing pains. Until the chimney breathed. One morning, Miriam Grice lit a fire. The smoke curled upward, normal at first, but then it drifted sideways, across the room instead of up. It slid along the baseboards, it coiled under the bed frames. She said it smelled wrong, not of ash, but of copper, of blood wet on iron. That night, one of the children woke screaming that someone had been speaking through the floorboards. Not in words, but in tune. A hymn, the same one the townsfolk had forbidden decades earlier. The next night, 2 more children woke to find soot on their pillows. No fire had been lit, and the fireplace was cold. The town noticed. They always do. People stopped waving at the Grice family. Children crossed the street to avoid walking past their fence. One man claimed he saw a child crouched in the chimney, staring out, but the chimney was sealed. Another swore he heard Margaret Halstead's voice calling his name from the Grice's porch. The exact cadence, the same pause between syllables. But Margaret had been gone 45 years, or something wearing her shape had been. On a gray March morning in 1904, Miriam Grice carried a bucket of kerosene through the house. She poured it carefully, room by room, not in rage, not in panic, slowly, like someone following instructions. She did not wake her children. She did not take her husband's hand. She struck a match in the hearth, said nothing, and stepped outside barefoot. She sat in the field and watched the flames climb the walls. By the time the sheriff arrived, the house was gone. Only the chimney stood, blackened but uncracked. Miriam was found curled in the grass, whispering the same line again and again. I just wanted the floor to stop whispering. The fire was ruled accidental. The state made no record of arson. No arrests were made. But Miriam was taken to the county infirmary. When a nurse asked why she hadn't saved her children, Miriam only blinked. She said they were never in danger. That whatever was in that house didn't want them. It wanted her. And it had been patient. In the days that followed, neighbors reported hearing tapping beneath their own floors, rhythmic even. A church deacon sealed his chimney with bricks and salt. Another family tore down their fireplace entirely. By summer, at least 4 homes had boarded their hearths. The fear wasn't fire. It was breath. That something inside the stone might still be inhaling, learning, waiting for a voice to fill again. A midwife named Ellen Holt began collecting stories. Oral accounts of what people had heard or seen near the Halstead place. She recorded dozens of testimonies. A woman who saw a child knock in patterns on her bedroom wall. A boy who hummed a tune he'd never learned, always in reverse. A man who, while repairing his roof, found handprints inside the chimney, too small, too perfect, pressed in soot that had not yet risen. Ellen compiled her notes and sent them to the state archive, but no reply came. The file was marked folklore. No further action was taken. The Grice children survived, but not together. 2 were sent east to an orphanage, 3 to a church in Illinois. 1 disappeared during the transition. The records list her as unaccounted for. Miriam never asked for them back. When asked years later if she remembered what happened that night, she said only one thing: that the house had not burned, that the voices were only hiding, and that some tunes don't need a singer, only a mouth warm enough to hum. And the chimney, they say, is still warm, even now. In the dim back wing of the Missouri State Archives, past the rows of brittle land deeds and water-stained census logs, there is a locked steel cabinet the clerks call the one no one opens. Its tag, etched into a brass plate so old the corners have curled, reads H 1859. No title, no description. Just those 4 characters, the letter and the year, enough to make the senior archivists exchange glances when a new hire asks. The inventory card says it holds 57 items. The ledger lists the key as signed out on April 3, 1921 by a man whose name, when checked against state records, does not appear in any birth registry, draft roll, or death notice. It is a name that exists nowhere but on that page. And the key never came back. The contents have never been formally described, but there are fragments, rumors from night shift janitors, hints and misplaced paperwork. A torn catalog slip with the words "child vocal sample wax cylinder" scrawled in ink. One archivist claimed she saw a folder inside marked "Spatial Entry Variants, Denton Hollow." But when she mentioned it to her supervisor, he told her to leave it alone if she valued her job. The cabinet has no duplicate key. No locksmith has been asked to force it open. It does not appear on the public index of holdings. Its presence is an open secret, like a scar the building learned to hide. The Halstead name appears nowhere in the archive's searchable database, and yet their shadow threads through unrelated documents like a watermark. County ordinances written in 1887 banning the addition of windowless rooms to residential homes. The 1909 amendment restricting chimney modifications after construction. Unusually, these laws do not cite fire risk, ventilation, or safety. Only psychological hazard and involuntary cognitive influence. The language is clinical but uneasy, as though the authors wanted to sound rational while keeping the true cause quiet. No one has repealed them. They remain on the books to this day. In the medical section of the archive, in an unremarkable box on institutional studies, the Halstead's absence becomes louder. Papers from psychiatric lectures mention transgenerational mimicry, the unproven idea that behavior, speech, and even memory can be passed between individuals without contact, using proximity and repetition alone. Most of the examples are theoretical, but one footnote references the hollow case and second-generation alignment subjects without explanation. That phrase appears in only 2 other places in the entire state record. Once in a closed mental hospital's admission log from 1912, and once in the index of restricted files pointing to cabinet H1859. No grave has ever been placed for Margaret, Ezra, Ruth, or Sarah Halstead. No obituary in any county paper, no death certificate filed in Missouri or neighboring states. And yet they are present in ways the living rarely are. Their house is gone, but its blueprint remains in the state's condemned structure registry, flagged with a warning that it is not to be replicated under any circumstance. Their case is not taught in criminal law, but it is whispered in certain investigative training sessions as an example of untraceable environmental influence. Their story is not in history books, but their absence is written into the rules of what cannot be built, where children cannot be kept, and what music is banned from public schools in Denton Hollow. It is as though the state has built a fence around a memory, not to preserve it, but to keep it from spreading. The missing key to H1859 is spoken of rarely and always quietly. Archivists say keys go missing often, but those who have seen the ledger notice a detail. Next to the signature is a notation. Return scheduled upon closure of case. No one knows which case it meant. The archives contain no open file from 1921 that matches the date. Some believe the key was stolen. Others believe it was never real, that the signature was written to suggest the cabinet was in use so no one else would try to open it. There is a third theory, one most don't say aloud, that the man who signed it out was one of the alignment subjects, fully grown, tasked with carrying the contents away to wherever such things are kept when even locked steel isn't enough. If that is true, it would mean the Halstead influence survived long enough to walk into that room under its own power. Those who work in the archive long enough start to notice other things. The faint hum in the far back hall, even when the lights are off. The way sound doesn't travel well past the cabinet, as though the air thickens. The feeling when you stand in front of it that something is waiting. Not to be freed, but to see if you're worth speaking to. One clerk claimed that on a late night in winter she passed the cabinet and heard tapping from inside. Not frantic, not loud, just steady. She did not look back. It is possible the Halstead case will never be solved. The truth may be gone, lost with those who lived it, or it may be sitting in that cabinet gathering dust in the dark. But perhaps the truth no longer needs paper or keys. Perhaps it has already done what it was meant to do. Shift from a family's private horror into something that moves without them. Because evil does not end when a name disappears from a registry. It does not end when a house burns. It ends only when no one remembers how to keep it alive. And in the Halstead case, someone remembered enough to teach, to pass it on, to hide it in plain sight until the next family stands in the wrong doorway. The cabinet still stands in the archive. The brass plate still reads H 1859. The key is still missing, or perhaps it was never meant to return. And if it did, if someone found it tomorrow and turned it in, who would be willing to open that lock and see what waits inside? Not the archivists, not the sheriff, not anyone who's heard the stories. Because the real question isn't what's in the cabinet. The real question is whether opening it would prove that it never needed to be locked in the first place. What do you think? Could this happen again? If it never really stopped? One half